In one breath, my peaceful life in Redwood Heights was shattered. Karen from our HOA had drained my precious backyard pond, claiming it was a health hazard. Anger boiled inside me, but so did a daring idea for payback. Before I unravel how I turned her fancy row of houses into a flood zone, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Buckle up, because this story dives right into trouble. I remember the exact moment I found out my pond was drained. I'd been out running errands in the morning, feeling that familiar sense of calm because my backyard water garden was my pride and joy. When I walked through the gate that afternoon, I felt my stomach drop. The water level was shockingly low, the fish gasping near the surface. At first I blamed a leak. Then I noticed footprints in the mud along the bank. Definitely not mine. I put two and two together quickly. Karen was the only person with a long-standing obsession over community health risks, and she had made plenty of threats about my pond in the past. She'd left a business card from some local maintenance service stuck in my mailbox, complete with a note stating, "Draining process completed. Kind regards, Redwood Heights HOA." I'd poured months of labor, and more money than I care to admit, into that pond. It wasn't just a hole of water. It was a piece of living art, carefully designed filters, balanced ecosystem, a few koi and goldfish that I'd practically named. The sight of them flailing in the muddy shallows triggered a surge of anger in me I'd never felt before. I scooped them up into a temporary tank, my hands shaking with both worry and rage. Karen's note implied the pond had become a mosquito breeding ground and a potential vector for disease. The fact that she had apparently skipped any formal notice left me speechless. I'd received no calls, no courtesy, heads up, nothing. I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a few deep breaths and tried to think logically. This was just like Karen: show up unannounced, ruin my property, and hide behind a flimsy excuse that she was doing the neighborhood a favor. HOAs can be helpful or oppressive depending on who leads them. In Redwood Heights, Karen had positioned herself as the queen bee. She thrived on picking at any perceived violation of the community guidelines, trimming hedges too short, painting your front door a non-approved color, letting your grass grow an inch too tall. She was relentless and disturbingly proud of it. Sometimes people around here joked that she'd ticket you for breathing loudly, but no one ever dared challenge her openly. I used to ignore her as best I could. My yard mostly conformed to the rules, so I'd had minimal friction with her until I started building my pond. The pond was my dream, a small oasis where I could unwind after my stressful day job. I invested in high-quality pumps, filters, and a protective net to keep away pests. I'd read up thoroughly on local regulations. I had a professional consultation to ensure no water lines or sewage pipes were at risk. In short, I did everything by the book. Yet from the moment Karen got wind of it, she was on a warpath. She claimed it would attract pests, complained about potential foul odors, and even insisted it might lower surrounding property values, though ironically I'd seen passers-by admire it from the street. Kids pointed excitedly, "Look, fish!" People told me how nice it looked. But for Karen, the pond was a personal affront. She demanded I fill it in. I refused. That's how it all started. The day before she drained my pond, I'd received an official letter from the HOA. It cited some obscure clause about maintaining a yard free of stagnant water and disease-carrying insects. I immediately responded, emailing their committee with photos of my fully functional filtration system. My water wasn't stagnant at all. I explained how I used mosquito dunks, environmentally friendly treatments. The letter demanded a reply within 2 weeks, yet not even 48 hours later, Karen took matters into her own hands. I confronted her at her house that evening. I still vividly recall her smug smile. She didn't even bother defending herself, just repeated, "It was for the good of the community." I told her she owed me restitution for the damage. She shrugged and said, "File a complaint if you want to, but my guess is the HOA will side with me." Her confidence came from the fact that she had enough allies on the board to rubber stamp her decisions. She had perfected the art of fear-mongering, labeling anything she disliked a health risk. That night I stared at the muddy crater where my pond used to be, feeling waves of anger, sorrow, and a grim kind of determination. I'd done nothing wrong. I had the receipts, the experts' sign-offs, yet there I stood, the victim of arbitrary power. By the time midnight rolled around, I felt something new crystallize in my mind. A plan to fight back, no matter how long it took. My immediate priority was to save my fish. I had a large spare tub from an old gardening project. I filled it with conditioned water, installed a spare pump, and carefully placed the stressed fish inside. As I watched them adjust to their new cramped home, my heart ached. This was not how I'd envisioned it, but I had to do what was necessary to keep them alive. While I'd never consider myself a vengeful person, I couldn't shake the urge to get back at Karen. She'd violated my property and done so without any legal courtesy. My neighbor and best friend Mike dropped by after hearing the commotion. He found me in the backyard, knee-deep in the muck of the drained pond, and listened as I vented. "Man," he said, "Karen is something else. Are you sure we can't just take her to small claims court?" I shook my head. "We could, but she'll spin it. She'll claim health hazards, drag in experts from her side, and bury me in HOA rules. It's not that easy." Mike nodded. "So, what's your plan?" I looked at the dried-out pond bed, at the scummy perimeter where the water line had been. My mind was whirling with technical details, old drainage maps, and the possibility of rerouting water. She wants to talk about health risks? Let's see how she handles a little water of her own. That night I barely slept. My mind was racing with the knowledge that Redwood Heights had a fairly intricate runoff system. Years ago, I'd done extensive reading on local infrastructure to ensure my pond wouldn't cause drainage problems. I understood the angles of the hills, the culverts that led stormwater around certain properties, and how the old pipes in some parts of the development were narrower than they should be. Karen's property, actually properties, sat on a gentle slope. She'd inherited multiple adjacent houses from a relative, renting some out while living in the grandest one in the middle. I knew that if water were to be redirected from the east side of the neighborhood, it would naturally flow downhill. Normally, the pond in my yard actually helped absorb some runoff, storing and filtering it before letting it seep into the ground. But now that it was drained, that protective feature was gone. If the next heavy rainstorm occurred, the ground around Karen's row of houses might become saturated quickly, especially if I made a few modifications to my property's drainage ditch that ran along the fence line. Was it petty? Possibly. But after seeing my fish nearly suffocate in the mud, I was done playing by Karen's one-sided rules. The first thing I did the following morning was contact a local landscaping company. I pretended I was just adding a decorative stone drainage channel along the edge of my yard. I kept the details vague, but they were more than happy to be paid to dig a shallow trench, line it with stones, and create a path that would direct water around the perimeter. I had them angle it slightly so that any overflow from rain would be guided away from the center of my yard, but conveniently it would wind up heading toward the back fence behind Karen's row. Of course, I also did enough research to ensure I wasn't violating any local codes. Technically, I was allowed to shape and grade my property as I wished, as long as I didn't dump water onto a neighbor's land in a way that violated city ordinances. But Redwood Heights was full of these weird gray areas. Karen had exploited them for years. Now I would do the same. While the landscapers worked, Karen came strutting by, arms folded, and gave me a disapproving glare. "So now you're turning your whole yard into a construction zone?" she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "I'm improving my property," I replied politely. "You did say you wanted everything up to HOA standards, right?" She scoffed, flicking her eyes to the small ditch. "Hope you're not planning on making another swamp. We don't need more hazards." I smiled as sweetly as I could manage. "No swamp, I promise. Just a little channeling of rainwater." For the next week, Redwood Heights was blessed with unseasonably dry weather, not a single drop of rain to test my new drainage setup. I found myself simultaneously relieved so I'd have more time to refine my plan, and a bit disappointed that I couldn't see the fruits of my labor yet. During that time, Karen kept up her usual routine, patrolling the neighborhood, handing out petty warnings to unsuspecting homeowners. If someone's car was parked incorrectly or a trash can was left out an hour too long, she was on it. Meanwhile, I spent my evenings continuing to rehabilitate my fish in the makeshift tub. It wasn't ideal, but they were alive, and that gave me hope I could rebuild something eventually. Mike dropped by with a six-pack one evening, and we sat in my garage, talking about everything from Karen's antics to how we might prove that what she did was illegal. He brought up a good point. You know, if the HOA bylaws don't explicitly give her the right to drain your pond without notice, she could be in trouble. She can't just call in a contractor without giving you a chance to address the issue first. But Karen's power came from intimidation and from a few key members of the HOA who supported her. I suspected that if I tried to follow official channels, I'd be stonewalled. I wanted something more immediate, more direct. It was late one night when I decided to do a final check on the newly installed drainage trench. The moon was out, illuminating the stones. The slope angled just so, ready to channel any significant runoff away from my yard. I couldn't help but picture a heavy storm, water coursing along the trench, heading downhill behind Karen's row. The idea of her smug face turning to shock when she realized her precious properties were the new health hazard made me smile, albeit with a flicker of guilt. I'd always prided myself on playing by the rules. My father had taught me to respect structure, law, and fairness. But fairness no longer existed in Redwood Heights, not with Karen at the helm. I felt strangely justified telling myself this was just cause and effect. She'd stripped away my pond's ability to buffer excess water, so now that water would find someplace else to go. That wasn't my fault. It was nature's. I was simply ensuring my property stayed dry. Despite my anger, there were moments I doubted whether I was going too far, but each time, I'd remember the sight of my fish floundering in the mud, the condescending smirk on Karen's face, and the abject helplessness I felt in that moment. That memory was enough to steel my resolve. It was in the second week after my pond's demise that the skies finally opened up. Local weather reports predicted a decent storm front coming in from the west, with a strong chance of continuous rainfall for at least 2 days. Perfect timing. I double-checked my yard, making sure the trench was clear of debris. The ground was already a bit parched, so the initial rain would soak in, but if it kept raining steadily, it would eventually saturate. I woke up early the next morning to the rhythmic sound of raindrops. Standing by my kitchen window, I watched water trickle off the roof. My heart pounded with a peculiar mix of excitement and anxiety. Was I truly about to watch my plan unfold? Or would it fail, leaving me with an even bigger mess? By midday, the storm had intensified. Puddles formed in low spots on the street, and I could see water streaming through the gutter. I grabbed a raincoat and stepped outside, heading to the backyard. The channel was working beautifully. Rivulets of water slid along the stones and out toward the back fence. I couldn't see exactly where it pooled, but I knew the slope well enough to predict it would pass behind Karen's row before continuing downhill. A bolt of guilt hit me again as I remembered that some of her neighbors might also be affected if the water pooled behind multiple houses. That was never my intention. I didn't want to punish innocent bystanders. But most of those houses had adequate drainage around their foundations, including Karen's. On a normal day, it wouldn't be a huge issue, but if the storm persisted... A call from Mike interrupted my spiraling thoughts. "Dude," he said, practically yelling into the phone over the sound of rain, "Karen is outside with an umbrella, checking out the water flow behind her property. She does not look happy." I peered over my fence. Sure enough, I saw the tip of her bright pink umbrella. I couldn't see her face, but I imagined it was twisted with confusion or anger. She must have noticed the increased flow. I took a few photos with my phone, just in case I needed evidence that I wasn't flooding her property maliciously. It was just water traveling along a legal drainage channel. As the day wore on, the downpour grew heavier. Normally, my pond would have absorbed a significant amount of this water, storing it temporarily. Now that it was gone, nothing held the excess back. This was the moment I had envisioned. Karen facing the direct consequences of her short-sighted sabotage. By late afternoon, I noticed the street in front of Karen's houses had visible flooding in the gutters. Cars carefully navigated around the pooling water, their tires sending up arcs of spray. I kept an eye on everything from my back window, an uneasy knot forming in my stomach. Despite my anger, I never wanted to cause real harm or put anyone in danger. I was aiming for a wake-up call, not a disaster. But the rain refused to relent. By evening, the local news reported road closures in parts of the county. Storm drains were working overtime. Redwood Heights was situated on a slight elevation, so typically we avoided the worst flooding that plagued lower-lying areas. However, we'd rarely had a storm this prolonged. And with my pond gone, that natural reservoir was missing from the system. Around 8 p.m., Mike sent me a text. "Front yard by Karen's place is a lagoon." My heart thumped wildly as I read it. I decided to see for myself. Under cover of darkness and rain, I ventured out, wearing a waterproof jacket and boots. Sloshing through puddles, I made my way down the sidewalk toward Karen's stretch of houses. Sure enough, the curbside in front of her property was under several inches of water. It lapped at the edges of her driveway. I spotted Karen standing on her porch with another woman, maybe a neighbor or a friend. Their expressions were grim. From the faint glow of her porch light, I could see her mouth moving in rapid, agitated bursts, as if she was shouting something. I kept my distance, not wanting a direct confrontation that night. While I felt a surge of dark satisfaction, I also felt the tension coil tighter in my chest. "Who do I call about this?" I heard her voice faintly. "This is unacceptable. Where is the runoff going? It's supposed to be directed away from the houses." I recalled how, ironically, my pond once collected much of that runoff. Now, with it drained, the water had nowhere to go but downhill. That was just simple physics. If she had let my pond remain, it might have relieved some pressure. Instead, she'd turned it into an empty basin. I went home, soaked to the bone but strangely resolute. I told myself that nature was simply taking its course. Karen had forced my hand, and if she tried to blame me, I could point to the fact that I had legally modified my yard, well within my rights, and she'd removed the barrier that had helped manage stormwater. Let her see how it felt to be at the mercy of decisions made without consultation. By the second day of the storm, the situation in Redwood Heights escalated. The local news stations sent out warnings for potential flash floods in our region. Most of the major roads were still open, but many suburban streets were experiencing significant pooling. I listened anxiously to the weather reports, which predicted another 24 hours of heavy rain before tapering off. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors. Some asked if I had any flooding. Others complained about Karen's doings. Word spread quickly that Karen's triple home row was suffering water intrusion. Some residents claimed they saw water seeping into basements. One rumor said a basement storage area in Karen's own house was filling with muddy water. I admit hearing that rumor gave me pause. I never intended for actual structural damage. My plan had always been more about giving her a symbolic taste of her own medicine. But if her basement was truly taking on water, the repair costs could be huge. Still, part of me thought, well, that's what you get for messing with my property without any due process. Then came the text I half expected, a message from the HOA board summoning me to an emergency meeting in their conference room. I arrived at the HOA's small community center, still wearing my rain jacket. The hum of tense conversation greeted me the moment I walked in. About 10 people sat around a rectangular table. Karen was there, her face stony. A few other board members glared at me as if I were some villain. Mike had come along as moral support. The board president, a man named Mr. Wilcox, cleared his throat and gestured for everyone to sit. "We have a serious issue with flooding around Ms. Karen's properties," he began, tapping his pen on the tabletop. "Several residents have reported unusual water flow since the pond behind your home was removed." He looked at me. "John, can you explain what's going on?" I took a deep breath, feigning calm. I'm not sure what you mean. My pond was drained by order of this HOA, presumably under Karen's authority. I didn't remove it by choice. Now that it's gone, there's nothing to buffer heavy rainfall. Nature is simply doing what nature does. Karen slammed her fist on the table. You dug a trench, didn't you? Don't lie. I saw workers on your property. You're redirecting the water toward my houses. I shrugged. I had a landscaping project done, which I have every right to do on my own property. I'm not breaking any laws or HOA regulations. If you'd like to provide evidence otherwise, please do. A heated discussion ensued. Karen accused me of sabotage. I calmly repeated that my yard modifications were within code, referencing a couple of official guidelines. Some of the board members were torn. They sympathized with Karen's flooding problem, but recognized she had overreached by draining my pond without adequate notice. Others questioned whether I'd intentionally set her up for disaster. Finally, Wilcox asked, "Why did you choose to grade your property in a way that directs water away from your yard but toward Ms. Karen's row?" I met his gaze. I wanted to ensure I wouldn't have a lake in my backyard after my pond was forcibly emptied. This is standard drainage practice. Slope the ground so water runs off. If we still had the pond, it might have helped retain some water, but that ship has sailed. Karen's jaw clenched. He's doing this on purpose, she practically hissed. Before I could respond, Mike spoke up, voice steady. Karen, you destroyed a functional water feature and left the property vulnerable. Did you expect the water to magically evaporate? You've got to accept responsibility here. I noticed a few of the board members nodding in agreement. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Wilcox raised a hand. All right, everyone, calm down. We'll investigate further. But for now, we need to find a solution to the immediate flooding. The meeting ended inconclusively. The HOA decided to hire an independent inspector to assess the changes in water flow. Karen stormed out, refusing to look at me. Outside, the rain kept hammering the streets. Mike and I exchanged a glance as we headed back to our cars. You okay? He asked. Yeah, I said, though my stomach was in knots. It feels weird, doesn't it? Almost like I set a trap. Maybe it's a wake-up call, Mike said. Karen's been throwing her weight around too long. Still, my mind churned. Would the inspector find any wrongdoing on my part? Could the HOA penalize me for something they effectively caused by removing the pond? There was a fine line between a legitimate drainage project and malicious intent. I had to trust that I hadn't crossed it. Technically. That night I dreamed of water surging around my house like a moat, while Karen's house sank into a bog. I woke with a start, unsettled by how consumed I'd become with this conflict. I reminded myself that she was the aggressor, but I also wanted to remain a decent human being. Rain battered the roof all night. By the next morning, Redwood Heights was in a soggy mess. Driving around, I saw standing water in various yards, but Karen's stretch was especially bogged down. The ground was swampy, and I heard from another neighbor that her basement sump pump was struggling to keep up. Around noon, I got a phone call from an unknown number. It was Karen's voice on the other end, although she sounded different, less confrontational, more desperate. "John," she began, pausing awkwardly, "we need to talk. Can you please come by my house? Or I can come to yours." A jolt of satisfaction shot through me. Karen, who had never politely asked anything of me, was now requesting a meeting. My first instinct was to blow her off, but curiosity and caution made me agree. I proposed she drop by my place, where she'd be on my turf. An hour later, she arrived, wearing tall rain boots and a jacket. The Karen I'd seen before was always upright and haughty, but now her shoulders were slumped. I invited her inside, and we stood in the living room with the sound of rain tapping the windows. She glanced around, as if noticing my home decor for the first time, pictures of family, a calm setting. She took a breath. "Look," she began, "I realize this might be difficult for you to believe, but I never intended to cause this much trouble. I was worried about a mosquito infestation. The West Nile virus is a real concern, and as HOA president, I'm responsible for the health and safety." I cut her off. "Karen, you drained my pond without following the protocol you yourself put in place. You didn't even give me time to address your concerns. You took something that mattered to me and destroyed it." She swallowed, looking down at her boots. For a moment she seemed genuinely remorseful. "I know. I admit it might have been an overreaction. But you have to understand, I've seen the consequences of ignoring potential hazards." I wanted to laugh. She was painting herself as some kind of vigilante hero, but I let her continue. She sighed, folding her arms. "I've got water creeping into my basement, John, and it's not just me. Some of the tenants in the adjacent houses are complaining about soggy yards, water damage. I need your help. The HOA is scrambling, but we're not sure how to fix this quickly." My help? She was asking for my help. The same woman who'd arrogantly dismissed my pleas to keep my pond intact. My immediate thought was, you reap what you sow. But then I glanced at the temporary tub where my surviving fish still lived, a makeshift solution. The memory of seeing them flop in the mud, helpless, returned to me. I rubbed my temples. "What do you want me to do? I'm not some stormwater engineer." She bit her lip. "You understand drainage. You built that pond. You must have studied how water flows here. Maybe you know a quick fix, or at least a temporary solution." Part of me wanted to throw her out. Another part recognized that the entire neighborhood could be impacted if the flooding worsened. Maybe I could propose a restoration of the pond, or at least something that would mitigate the storm. I offered her a seat, and we talked for the next hour. It was a strange, tense conversation. She acknowledged, though begrudgingly, that she might have acted too quickly about the pond. I explained how the pond had helped absorb heavy rainfall. Removing it abruptly left the ground less permeable. Coupled with my new drainage trench, it sent a large volume of water toward the lower slope. She asked if I could fill the trench or block it. I reminded her that she'd forced me to drain my pond, so I had no reason to trust that reversing the trench would solve anything for me, since I'd end up with pooling water in my yard. I also mentioned that the time it would take to regrade everything might not be feasible with the storm ongoing. She seemed exasperated. "So there's no quick fix?" I shrugged. "Not without a full drainage overhaul, or rebuilding the pond, maybe. That's not exactly a quick fix either, but if we put the basin back and direct flow into it, we could at least contain some of the water. The big question is whether the HOA would allow me to do it after all the fuss you made." She stared at me, her expression a mix of desperation and disbelief. The next day, Karen convened another emergency HOA meeting. This time I was invited as a sort of consultant. It felt surreal standing there, describing how reintroducing a properly designed pond might alleviate some of the flooding issues. The board members listened with varying degrees of skepticism. I showed them diagrams, old reference materials I still had, including the official site survey I'd used for my original construction. "A retention pond is beneficial," I explained. "It can be designed with a controlled outlet so it releases water slowly. This mitigates flash flooding." Karen's expression remained stoic, but I could see frustration in her eyes. She was in a corner now, publicly acknowledging her mistake. Some board members seemed open to the idea, others worried about liability or the timeline. "We've got water issues now," one of them pointed out. "We can't wait weeks for a pond to be rebuilt." I agreed it wouldn't solve the immediate crisis, but suggested that we could at least start preparing for the next big rainfall. Meanwhile, a more immediate measure might be installing additional French drains or pumps behind Karen's properties to divert water. After the meeting, Karen pulled me aside. "If we let you rebuild your pond, will you do it? Will you help me with the current flooding?" she asked quietly. A part of me recognized that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Karen was effectively capitulating to the very concept she once despised. but I also felt worn out from all the drama and tension. "Yes," I finally said, "if you sign an agreement stating you won't unilaterally destroy it again, and you'll allow me to maintain it in accordance with city guidelines, not your personal whims." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "Fine. Just get rid of this water in the meantime." That night, HOA workers brought in sump pumps and started diverting water away from the houses, using temporary hoses that emptied into the storm drains on the main road. It was a messy, noisy operation, but it kept Karen's basements from turning into underground swimming pools. I watched from my window, feeling a twinge of vindication. The next morning, the rain finally eased. The storm clouds drifted on, leaving Redwood Heights waterlogged but still standing. With the floodwaters receding, the urgency died down a bit, though some damage had been done. Karen's basement had taken on a few inches of water, damaging boxes of old clothes and a couple of pieces of furniture. The tenants in the adjacent houses reported damp walls. Karen and the HOA would likely be on the hook for repairs. Meanwhile, I wasted no time setting up a meeting with a local contractor who specialized in water features. If we were going to restore the pond, I wanted it done right, and bigger and better than before. Karen might be forced to let this happen, but I intended to ensure it was fully compliant so she'd have no legal wiggle room to sabotage it again. It felt surreal that just days ago I was gleefully anticipating how my yard modifications might flood her homes. Now I was planning a new pond that would in effect protect her property. The irony was thick. But maybe that was the best outcome, a mutual understanding that we couldn't keep sabotaging each other or the entire community would suffer. As we finalized the plans, Karen and I had another talk, this time a bit more cordial. We stood by the mucky crater that remained of my original pond site, the ground still soft from all the rain. She looked at me, arms folded, but her posture not as confrontational as before. "I guess this is where I admit that I should have handled things differently," she said quietly. "We could have tested your water, or set up mosquito traps, or actually discussed it like reasonable adults." I nodded. It would have saved us both a lot of hassle. She let out a breath that sounded more like a sigh of regret. "I was so focused on potential worst-case scenarios, I didn't stop to think that your pond might actually be beneficial. And now I'm dealing with a real worst-case scenario, a mini flood." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of empathy. "I understand you were worried, but next time, talk to me before you do something drastic." She gave a small half-smile. "Deal." The contractor arrived a few days later. Together we laid out stakes and spray paint to mark the boundaries of the new pond. Karen and a couple of HOA board members hovered nearby taking notes. My design was more ambitious this time. A deeper basin, a better filtration system, and a natural rock waterfall feature. I explained that deeper water wouldn't stagnate as easily, and a waterfall would help aerate it. Karen eyed the plans warily. "How much is this all going to cost?" she asked. I shrugged. "It's not cheap, but it's an investment in the neighborhood's drainage solution, right?" She nodded reluctantly, aware that a big chunk of the expense might come from the HOA's budget, given that they'd effectively forced me to drain the old pond without just cause. The board members were hashing out how to allocate funds, but we'd reached a preliminary agreement. They would cover part of the rebuild as a way of correcting the mistake. I would cover some costs too, especially for the aesthetic features. As construction started, I noticed a shift in my neighbors. People who once kept their heads down and ignored the HOA drama began stopping by to chat. They seemed curious, asking questions about how a pond could help with stormwater management. Some even offered to help, lending tools or providing snacks for the workers. It felt oddly empowering, as if the community was realizing they didn't have to fear Karen's rulings anymore. A few neighbors voiced complaints about petty HOA citations they'd received. Karen, seeing the change in mood, toned down her usual authoritarian approach. She was still the HOA president, but her credibility had taken a hit when her actions led to partial flooding. Even Mike commented on the shifting atmosphere. "Dude, it's like you cracked the Karen code. Everyone sees she's not infallible. She messed up big time." I just smiled, remembering the intense anger I'd felt when I first found my pond destroyed. It was hard to believe we'd gotten to this point, where the solution involved building an even better pond than before. Meanwhile, the inspector the HOA hired finally submitted his report. He confirmed that my trench was legal and within city guidelines. He also noted that the removal of the original pond contributed to localized flooding during the storm. Karen tried to keep the findings under wraps, but someone on the board leaked the information to a neighborhood chat group. Soon, everyone knew the truth. "That pond was never a health hazard," the inspector wrote in his conclusion. "It was a beneficial feature, and had it remained in place, it likely would have mitigated some of the flooding." I felt both vindicated and exhausted. The roller coaster of emotions left me wanting to just settle down in a chair by my future pond, feed my fish, and ignore the world for a while. But at least I had the weight of official proof on my side. Karen approached me one afternoon while the workers were pouring gravel into the new basin. She seemed subdued, arms at her side, looking more human than she ever had in my eyes. "I read the inspector's report," she said, voice subdued. "I guess I owe you an apology. And, an apology to the neighborhood. This has gotten out of hand." I nodded, trying not to revel in her admission. "Apology accepted," I replied. "I'm just glad we're moving forward with a constructive solution." She half smiled. "I'm not used to being wrong, you know." I held back a chuckle. "Yeah, I can tell." For a moment we just stood there, watching the bobcat machinery move dirt around, forging the shape of what would become a brand new pond. There was something cathartic about seeing the ground transformed again, this time with official backing rather than clandestine sabotage. Later that week, the contractor installed the liner and filled the pond halfway to test for leaks. Thankfully, it held water perfectly. Then came the addition of gravel, rocks, and aquatic plants. I supervised everything meticulously, wanting to ensure this pond would be bulletproof if Karen or anyone else ever tried to shut it down again. When it was time to introduce the fish, I felt a wave of excitement. My surviving koi and goldfish had been living in a temporary setup for weeks. Finally, they would have a spacious, beautiful new home. Mike came over, helping me transfer them in large plastic bags. A small group of curious neighbors gathered, forming a little audience around the pond's edge. As the fish slid into the water, I felt an overwhelming relief. They'd been through so much, but here they were, gliding among the stones and aquatic plants like they belonged. A smattering of applause broke out from the onlookers. Even Karen was there, her posture uncharacteristically relaxed. She clapped softly, wearing a polite smile. In the aftermath of the pond's reconstruction, the HOA held a community meeting to address broader concerns. Several residents voiced their frustration at how easily Karen had mandated the draining of my pond. Some demanded that the HOA establish clearer protocols for property disputes. Karen, for the most part, stayed humble during the meeting, promising to revise procedures so something like this wouldn't happen again without due process. I spoke up, suggesting an educational approach. Maybe we can form a small committee to help neighbors with landscape features, ensuring everything meets code while also encouraging creativity and environmental benefits. Surprisingly, I got a lot of nods. People seemed eager to reduce the tension that had built up under Karen's strict oversight. It felt like a turning point, a moment when Redwood Heights could become a more cooperative and friendly place to live. One side effect of the fiasco was that many neighbors, having seen the success of my pond, now wanted their own small water features. A few folks asked if I could recommend contractors or share tips. Karen even joked that we might turn Redwood Heights into Koi Kingdom. She quickly clarified she was just kidding, but at least her humor signaled she was loosening up a bit. In a way, Karen's downfall was also her chance for growth. She'd gotten a taste of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a crisis she partially caused. That empathy might not fully erase her controlling tendencies, but it tempered them enough that we could have civil conversations. Still, I made sure all the legal paperwork for my new pond was crystal clear. I didn't want any chance of a repeat scenario if Karen ever woke up on the wrong side of the bed. With the pond completed and the water flowing through the small waterfall feature, I finally felt a deep sense of peace. I remember standing out there one evening at dusk, the air warm and humming with the sounds of crickets, the water gently cascading over rocks. My koi swam lazily near the surface as if content to be back in a proper home. Mike joined me, handing me a cold soda. We watched the reflection of the sky on the water's surface. "You did it," he said softly. "And you taught Karen a lesson she'll never forget." I exhaled, feeling months of tension melt away. "I guess so. I just hope it sticks." He laughed. "If she forgets, we can always remind her of the time she nearly turned Redwood Heights into a swamp." The two of us chuckled, though a part of me felt a wave of relief that we'd avoided a bigger disaster. Everything had settled into a kind of equilibrium now. My yard once again had a pond at its heart, a testament to persistence, a silent witness to the conflict that nearly tore our neighborhood apart. As the weeks passed, Redwood Heights dried out completely. The storm damage was repaired. Karen's basement had to be professionally cleaned and dehumidified, but after settling with insurance and covering some out-of-pocket costs, she bounced back, albeit with a lighter wallet. The tenants in the adjacent houses got some help from the HOA for minor repairs. No permanent harm was done, though the memory of wading through ankle-deep water. My new pond quickly became a small attraction in the neighborhood. People walked by with their children, pointing at the vibrant koi. I even installed a simple bench next to it, inviting folks to sit and enjoy. A curious hush fell over Redwood Heights. The tension of the past had been replaced with conversation and a sense of collaboration. Karen, for her part, seemed to step back from her usual micromanaging. The board insisted on distributing responsibilities so she wasn't the sole enforcer of every minor rule. She still had a role, but now she had to consult with others before making unilateral decisions. I heard from neighbors that she was more polite during inspections. She didn't hand out warnings like Candy anymore. A few weeks after everything settled, she stopped by my place unannounced one afternoon. I wasn't sure whether to feel wary or curious, but I greeted her with a smile. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for your help. I know we had our differences, and I apologize again for how I acted. Let's keep Redwood Heights beautiful together." It wasn't exactly a hallmark moment, but it felt genuine enough. I nodded, meeting her gaze. "Thanks," I said. "Truce?" She managed a little laugh. "Truce?" Over time, I realized that what started as an act of retaliation had grown into a catalyst for positive change. By exploiting the HOA's own rules and exposing their double standards, I forced a reckoning. The entire neighborhood benefited from clearer guidelines and a greater appreciation for well-designed landscaping. People began planting pollinator gardens, setting up small water features, and collaborating on projects that improved property values in a sustainable way. Yes, I'd been angry, livid even, when Karen drained my pond. I'd felt entitled to revenge, and at one point I might have been content to watch her row of houses flood without remorse. But seeing how it all played out, I felt grateful that the consequences, while significant, hadn't spiraled into a true catastrophe. Looking back, I can't say I regret orchestrating that drainage ditch. It opened Karen's eyes to the reality that every action has a reaction. She learned that dictatorial oversight can backfire spectacularly. In many ways, our conflict highlighted the importance of dialogue, respect, and proper process. Still, there's a small part of me that wonders if I should have tried harder to reason with her from the start. Perhaps I could have avoided the entire fiasco. But then again, maybe Karen needed a dose of her own medicine to truly understand the damage she was causing. Now, whenever I sit by my pond, listening to the waterfall and watching my fish glide in the clear water, I feel a deep sense of contentment. It's more than just a backyard feature, it's a symbol of resilience. It survived Karen's wrath, and it came back even stronger. So that's how my story ends, for now. I got my pond back, bigger and better than ever, and Karen got a lesson in humility that probably no one else could have taught her. Our neighborhood, once plagued by her constant interference, found a healthier balance. And for those of you who stuck with me through this entire saga, thank you. If you ever find yourself dealing with a self-proclaimed HOA dictator, remember, knowledge is power, nature can be unpredictable, and sometimes you have to let the water flow where it may. In the end, my peaceful life in Redwood Heights returned, albeit with a bit more laughter when people recall how Karen's crusade against a health hazard pond ended with her own properties underwater. I never wanted to be the villain, but I did want to stand up for what was right. Maybe I wasn't completely innocent in my methods, but at least now I can breathe easy, listening to the gentle splash of water in my backyard, knowing that my fish are safe. And Karen, well, she's finally learned that respecting your neighbors goes a long way toward keeping your feet dry.